Hello, this is Kai the Artist with Paradisioproductions. I hope everyone's having a fantastic day. Today I wanted to talk about how I do the audio for our voiceovers and lens reviews, and specifically how I mix both the music in the background as well as the voiceover itself. So I've got a quick composition put together that I'll play part of for our Sigma versus Canon review, and all I've done as far as mixing goes for this is just some basic leveling. So this is what that sounds like.
I want to compare the wide-angle zoom that I use for full-frame photography, the Canon 16 to 35 f2.8, and the Sigma 18 to 35 f1.8 that I use for my black motion pockets in my camera 4K. I'm going to shoot the lens at the exact same setting, except for the film for 16mm.
Okay, so that's basically it. As you can hear, this needs quite a bit of mixing before it sounds good. You can barely hear his vocals, and as you can see, like I said, I've done nothing as far as mixing goes, aside from some rough volume leveling, so there really isn't anything done to this yet. It's still really dry. So right now, we'll take a moment to render the sound to a multi-track in order to avoid CPU problems later on, so make sure you hit that split mixer track option if you do this, and we'll take you over to our new project file. Alright, so here I've got the new project file up. I've already named and assigned all my tracks, and the way I did this was I went to this track mode option down here. It's really useful. If you scroll down, you can check off one of your mixer tracks and it'll assign whatever's on this playlist track to that mixer track. It's also nice because it'll put any automation you add to that mixer track right below this playlist track. So it's really nice as far as workflow organization goes. Moving over to my mixer, as you can see I've reset all my levels since they were rendered in that last project file. I've got my sidechain and drum buses going over to my mix bus. So I actually don't like this for this project since I want to be able to control both of these tracks' volumes and the vocals individually. So right now, since they all send to the mix bus, we can't do that. So I'll take this track down from here and pull it over, add a separator, and name it submix. So it's already sent to the mix bus. This must be something left over from my composition when I didn't really know how many tracks I'd need, but that's okay. So we'll send our drums and our sidechain directly into that instead of our mix bus. And now using this fader, we can control the volume of just the music. So I think it's time we actually get started mixing. I'll start with some stereo imaging. Since these keys are musically the focal point of the track, we should start with those. So I'll solo this, and we can open up Waves S1 Shuffler. So this is a really intuitive plugin because it lets you control not only the rotation, but also the asymmetry of the sound. Basically, the rotation's gonna work just like left-right panning will, but the asymmetry then takes it a step further. It keeps anything in the center of that particular track in the center, and then it'll still pan out the sides based on how you rotate it. There's a lot of different ways that you can use this, but I find it really helpful for dialing in the exact position of the sound. Obviously though, if you don't have this or another imaging plugin that can do the same thing, you can always just use regular left-right panning, and that should come with any DAW. So we can play this in context and monitor until it's in a spot we like.
Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35mm, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we need. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35mm, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we need. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35mm, everything's still looking good.
You can see that I took a little bit of the width out of it and it ended up around 29.5 degrees to the left with about -48 asymmetry. From here, let's move on to this lead. So I'll actually play this in context with just those keys. All this sound does is harmonize with them, so we definitely don't want those fighting for space in the mix. So I'll open up another S1 and we'll just pan this to the opposite side of those keys until they're both apparent. listen to that in context.
Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into
So I don't really like the way those sit with those vocals. I'll go back into S1 and just tweak that until they're both a little clearer.
Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise, this is a nice
We can
sharp
listen to just the keys and the lead again and make sure they still sit well together. So from here, let's work on that lead number 2. I don't really want to move too much into the left with those keys just yet, so let's open up S1 on this track, and we can put those a little wider to the right than our last lead. And we'll just tweak that until it's apparent in the mix and doesn't interfere with the other lead.
Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise,
So I want to talk about this bass a little bit. One thing you may have noticed is, it's in stereo. Now typically for pop music, we want to keep the bass frequencies towards the center, but I want to take all the stereo signal out of this one. We can open up another instance of S1, and I'll just bring that width in enough so that it still sounds somewhat wide, but doesn't overwhelm the sides.
everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch.
So something you'll notice as you progress through this stage of the mix is the more you pan things and do things like subtractive EQ, the more logic you start integrating into your mix. Like with those keys, for example. At first, we could have put them more or less anywhere we wanted to and built from there. But as soon as we panned them left, it made sense to put the lead sound to the right for both to be clearly heard. We're going to do something similar with these hi-hats. The sound itself is very attack heavy, and the closest similar sound would be that lead number 2 we just mixed, since it's got kind of a plucky element to it. Since that's panned relatively far right, we'll pan our hi-hats relatively far left, and I'll do it a little differently this time. So this plugin's another one from Waves. It's called Brower Motion. Think of it like a panner that moves as the track plays. So we can set a rough path for this to go down and play it in context.
Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we hear. Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good.
Another cool aspect of this plugin is it allows you to add some motion-based compression, so let's add some character to those hi-hats. And real quick, I can A-B that for you so you can hear what we've done so far, and we can move on to some subtractive EQ and finish up getting this to a rough mix.
Otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything's still looking good.
From here, I want to just focus on the music for a bit, so we'll keep the vocals muted for most of this part, and we can start with focusing on the bass and the kick. So these have a very important relationship in your mix. Typically, they make up the bulk of your center channel, so they kind of end up becoming something like the backbone of your mix. But since they're both panned to the center, you can very quickly end up losing clarity. So we'll play these together real quick, and I'll make sure that I've got both of my kicks unmuted. Since the sidechain kick sends through the kick track, we'll only have to EQ that one track. And I'll open up an EQ for our kick and our bass. In this case, I'll use Eosis. And we want to look for the most characteristic frequencies. I'll start with our bass. So in this case, I like around 65 Hz, and we'll now move over to our kick, and we can start cutting that same frequency from it. And now let's do the same for our bass. For our kick, I like around 135 Hz. so we'll go over to our bass and make some cuts. And from here we can clean up our bass a little bit. I'll start by adding a high pass and a low pass just to cut out any unnecessarily low sounds that may muddy up our mix and any high frequencies that we just don't like. And then from here we can turn the Q factor up to 7 for a few of these other knobs, so we can isolate frequencies and look for anything annoying. I like the way this sounds, so let's do our kick next. We'll use the same principles by making a high and low pass, and usually for my kicks I like to cut the mids a little bit and just look for any sounds that might take away from the punchiness. We can do our snare next. For our snare, I'm hearing some lows that might end up fighting with the bass a little bit, so we'll cut those out and just follow these same steps for anything else that sounds annoying. And I'll A/B that real quick. I think we can move on to some instruments.
Still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we can. Even at 200% skip.
So next we've got those keys. I'll cut the highs and lows from those, as well as anything that sounds annoying to me. Before I move on, I also want to bring down my hats and bass a little, since they're way too loud in the mix. Alright, that's much better. And now let's move on to that first lead. For this one, I want the cuts to be a bit sharper. On this plugin, they call that water and fire, but it basically just adjusts your Q factor and the volume a bit, so you can replicate something like this with just about any EQ that you have. And I'll do the same for our last lead. As we cut down these frequencies, keep in mind that I'm not usually taking too much more than a decibel or two off of them. It's easy to run into the trap of not hearing huge differences with your cuts or boosts, and then wanting to either cut or add more, but winding up with either a muddy or a thin sounding mix. 99% of the time, once you're done mixing your audio, it's still going to go through some compression at some point, which will basically take those loudest points and make them softer, while taking the softest points and making them louder. So if we think about it this way, we can try to mix a few steps ahead. We only need to remove as much as would be annoying or cause any ear fatigue once it's been made loud and compressed. And if later on you give it another listen and decide to make some more changes, you'll have less to undo, and it'll be a lot easier to figure out what needs to be cut than it is to try to figure out what's been cut too much when you can't hear it anymore. And I did mess up a little bit and did some of my hi-hat EQing off screen, but here's my high and low cuts, and we don't want to take too much from our hi-hats, but we definitely want to cut down on these whistly frequencies that'll hurt your ears. Alright, that sounds good to me. I'll just A-B that for you and we can get an idea of before and after. So I think that about covers our subtractive EQ. Just keep in mind that even if each individual track or instrument doesn't sound hugely different, it all builds up on each other for the final piece. We don't need to make these frequencies completely inaudible by making big cuts, we just want to make enough cuts that everything sounds a bit cleaner. So let's talk about sidechaining. If you notice down here, my sidechain kick track routes to my sidechain bus without any volume. I'll actually do the same for my snare in this case, and unroute my kick track before it ends up confusing me. So if we pull up Fruity Limiter, set it to comp, and right click under sidechain, it'll pull up a list of tracks that are routed to this one. So we'll select our sidechain kick, and I'll show you what this does. So what you saw as I lowered the threshold is that every time the sidechain kick played, Fruity Limiter was ready to compress the whole sidechain bus. So I'll drop the threshold a bit more, apply some compression, and shorten that release a bit. And we can adjust it in context until the kick sits better in the mix. So that's basically all sidechaining is. We can go ahead and do the same for our snare, but to a lesser degree. And as you can probably hear that even with less compression added to the snare, it still has no problem cutting through that mix. The reason for this is it doesn't have to fight with the bass nearly as much as the kick does. If you remember when we did our subtractive EQ, I cut the snare around 100 Hz, and that alone was enough to clear up most of any potential issues we could run into with muddiness. We also made our cuts with the kick and bass, if you remember, and this most definitely helps as a piece of making your kick and bass both pop out. They still do share a lot of similar frequencies though, and like I said, they're both running pretty much straight down our center channel. With that said though, every track's different, and sometimes you won't even need to sidechain. The important part is that you go in with a goal in mind, and if it doesn't turn out, you can always just keep playing with it. So we're just about done with our rough mix, but still sounding pretty dry to me. Let's jump into some reverb. So you'll notice here I've got this reverb send set up with nothing on it. Let's open up Verb Suite Classics and put a reverb on. The way I usually pick this is to solo my snare, send it to the reverb, and then go through options until it sounds good to my ear. I definitely want a plate reverb for this track, so let's try this fat plate. And I like this for now. So we can go through all of our tracks in context and place them in this reverb. So you definitely don't want to add too much reverb to your track, but I'll A/B this real quick for you just so you can get an idea of just how much this does to a mix. So that's just reverb alone, but we're not done yet. Just like any other part of our mix, we have the potential for those annoying frequencies that can hurt our ears or muddy our mixes. So I'll open Yosis again, and in context we'll do our low and high cuts. And lastly, I just want to add a little more width to this. We can open up one more instance of S1, and in context, we'll adjust that width fader until it sounds wide enough, but the sides aren't too reverby. We can also play with this shuffle fader a bit. This will just add some additional width to some of our lower frequencies. And we can hear how much the width in this adds to our entire track. So before we move over to our vocals, there's one thing that I want to mention about levels. So if you use FL Studio like me, it kind of lets you cheat a little bit by putting Fruity Limiter on your master fader. So right now it's set to limit rather than compress, and this makes sense for it to be on the master fader. Typically a hard limiter would be the last effect on your mastering chain. And what that'll do is it'll take a specified level of loudness in decibels, and any signal that goes over that level will get crushed down, similarly to how a compressor works. This will be a little more intense than a compressor though, since it literally will not allow any signal to get louder than that specified level. So this is bad for us right now because we're nowhere near ready to master this. But with that said, you might not even use FL Studio or have a plugin like this on your master fader, which brings me to the issue of clipping. So right now, I don't believe that anything's clipping, and you can tell because our peaks don't really cross that line. If we did and we were to keep the limiter on, it'd sound like this and look like this as it crushes our track. Now if you're a beginner, this can be misleading because it doesn't per se sound bad. But we want to think about this as a whole project rather than just the context of our mixing stage. Like I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of your tracks are going to end up getting compressed down the line. If it's already been crushed as much as it can be through a limiter, you'll end up losing a lot of the clarity and dynamics that make a track sound good. Also, if this is something you plan on sending to a mastering studio and it's already crushed, you'll run into that same problem when the engineer applies their own compression and limiting. Or even worse, if you haven't used a limiter at all, your track may end up actually clipping and distorting the sound of your mix. So I think it's time to move on to our last step and mix down these vocals. So let's start with a subtractive EQ.
Otherwise, this is a
We'll
nice
make our
sharp
high
edge.
and low cuts and be
Zooming it
extra
into
careful
35
not to take
millimeters,
too much
everything's
away
still
from the
looking good.
vocals.
Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we can get. Even at 200% scale, things are looking decent.
Next, I want to
Now let's
take
give
away
the
some of
cannon
those
the same
nasally
test.
sounds at the high
Right
end
away,
that you'll
here's-
wind up with from
otherwise,
most
this is a
vocal
nice
tracks.
sharp image.
We can also look for any sibilance up here, which is that p, t, or s kind of sound, as well as any potential room noise in the take itself. Since this is a voiceover, we really don't want to take too much away from these vocals, since they'll be significantly more prominent in our mix than the music is. So as far as the lower frequencies go, you want to avoid cutting out that lower thickness from the voice and making it sound brittle. But I typically do find some muddiness somewhere between 200 to 300 or even as far up as 400 hertz in most takes. You want to cut that out, but don't take too much away from it. And I'll A/B that real quick.
But otherwise, this is a nice sharp image. Zooming it into 35.
So before I compress this, I want to bring up levels/clipping again. Just looking at that limiter we had up before, I can tell you that once we have the vocals up to the loudness they need to be at, we'll be too loud. So that's where our submix fader from earlier comes in handy. I'll just pull this down until everything sits right.
Zooming it into 35 millimeters.
And it sounds like I actually forgot to send the reverb to our submix, so I'll send that now. And I like this for right now, so let's compress. While we compress, we definitely want our vocals in context. I'll unloop what we've already mixed just so we're not listening to the same line on repeat, and mute any tracks we haven't worked on yet. And I'll open up Virtual Mix Rack from Slate Digital. So this is easily one of my favorite plugins. It's more of a bundle. It comes with a bunch of plugins that are all modeled off of real vintage gear, as well as some that they designed on their own, but still based on that analog gear and meant to have that analog kind of sound. I like it for the coloration it adds to your track, but if you don't have something like this, any compressor should work for you. Also, just before I compress, I typically like to put a virtual preamp and console on my vocal track just to give it some additional life. So that's what these two are. I've already got them set up. To simplify it, they're effectively adding character to the vocals to make them sound like they've been sent through. I think this one's a Telefunken V76 preamp and an SSL 4000 G series console. So basically, this is adding saturation and warmth to our take. So like I said, this is one of my favorite plugins. If this is something you'd like to hear more about, please let me know in the comments, and I'd love to ramble about it. Alright, and with that said, let's add the FG401 compressor to the chain and listen to this all in context.
Things are looking decent. Now let's give the Canon the same test. Right away, the extra distortion is visible around the corners and the edges of the frame. Perhaps this is attributable to the extra 2mm. Zooming into 35mm, things are improving for the Canon. I am noticing some blue tint to the shadows, however. At 200%, the Canon is breaking down a bit. Textures are losing definition and getting muddy.
And I'll A/B that so you can hear before and after.
Onto our second setup. The Sigma is displaying some distortion and again at the corners. Zooming into 35mm gives us a very pleasing and sharp image. Bumped into.
And that's pretty much it. Since the vocals are so prominent for this particular type of project, we don't want to crush the dynamics too much or it won't sound natural. I did a relatively fast attack and release, and basically how this works is the compressor will first hear your signal, and then it'll have so long before the compression starts being applied. This is your attack. It'll also have so long before the compression stops being applied, which makes up your release. And again, we don't need to compress this too much, so I did a pretty quick release and a ratio of only about 2.5 to 1. So this way we can still maintain the dynamics to our vocals, but they're just a bit more tamed to help our levels stay consistent, which in turn helps our vocals sit on top. And I also do want to add some EQ to this one, just to give our vocals a little more presence. So we'll put on FGN, and we'll do this similarly to how we did our subtractive EQ. We'll boost a frequency and search for frequencies, but instead of searching for ones we don't like this time, I want to look for ones that I do like, that I think will help the vocals cut through a bit better. And then we can drop the boost down to a good level, and I like that. So lastly, I just want to add a de-esser to this. This will cut out any of that leftover sibilance you're hearing, and this does work a little differently than how our subtractive EQ worked earlier. Rather than just making a cut in the loudness of a particular range, it'll actually compress that range as it hits your specified level. So I'll open Waves de-esser, and right here you can adjust our range, and I'll solo our vocals and set this to sidechain, and we can look for what we're trying to get rid of.
Basic color grade will be applied to each clip to highlight.
And we can get a quick before and after of that.
Our first scene is here at the bridge. The Sigma is showing some distortion in the corners at 18 millimeters, but otherwise, this is a nice sharp
and back
image.
Into context.
Zooming it into 35 millimeters, everything is still looking good. Let's get that focus close in on the branch to see what detail we can get. Even at 200% scale, things are looking decent. Now let's give the Canon the same test. Right away, the extra distortion is visible around the corners and the edges of the frame.
Alright, so that's really it. Aside from those tracks we didn't get to, I'd say this is a finished rough mix. Typically from here, if this was for a client, this would be a good time to send off a sample. That way they get a good idea of what their finished project will sound like, at least as it is now, and you as the mix engineer haven't poured hours and hours into something that might not even end up being the one. Now I know I've been rambling for a while now, and this video is probably around like a half hour if not longer, so I'll go ahead and we'll get the rest of these tracks mixed at this point on my own, and I'll see you for part 2 where we'll go over compressing your instrument tracks, automation, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great day.